thank you so much for inviting me to do this talk. It's one of the ones I've done several times over the years, and it's actually obviously one of my favorite because it was basically the foundation of my dissertation several years ago. And it's really interesting when I look back at the original slides to where it's come today and how it's changed and shifted, and not so much because of what's being done in the research, but the ways in which this culture of hip hop is always changing and growing and moving in very different directions all the time. So this talk is titled Freaks, Gold Diggers, Divas, and Dykes, which is from the paper on which this was based and came out of several years of research and has been built upon since then. And what I have to start off by saying is that this is really looking at the ways in the media, and specifically mainstream media, has constructed ideas about Black women's sexual identity, particularly young Black women, within this sort of commercialized now culture of hip hop. And I'm going to sort of give a sort of historical framework about the sexual scripts that have emerged, what it means, and how it's really not about hip hop, but a larger historical framework of how we look at Black women and the centrality of their sexuality and how it's been portrayed across various genres and its impact on psychological well-being. But before I go further, I always have to talk about the fact that although this presentation is specifically looking at Black womanhood, I know that there are scripts and frameworks that go cross-culturally for women. So for example, there's a large body of research that looks at images of white womanhood that includes like the early Britney Spears, or when she's very sweet and innocent, and then of course she did the hair shaving and slave for you sexuality image. Or of course we have Miley Cyrus here, which is a more recent example where they start off as the innocent, sweet girl, Disney girl. In that case, both girls were Disney girls next door. And then they suddenly become wild, the loose, fun time girl. And we've seen this across time. Madonna did the same images. You've seen this played over and over. And then you shift to the ice queen. And usually this tends to be put upon older white women where they're frigid and cold and controlling. And again, these are images that have been studied in the literature and we see played over and over again, the media, to sort of play on stereotypes that are specific to framing certain groups of women, in this case, white women, in a really sort of predictable manner. For Asian women, of course, we have the tiger lily, which is this sweet, passive, submissive woman who's really sort of, again, kind of like the innocent girl next door. And then you become this sort of dragon lady where she's sneaky and emasculating and using her sexuality over and over again. So you see that Lucy Liu plays this character often, or she's called upon to play this character. And then the mama-san, which is the asexual kind of Mammy kind of image. We'll talk about that. Maternal, caring for the other characters, that kind of strong woman that you see that's taking place. Then for Latinas, there's a lot of images that play out too. And so you have La Dolorosa, which is this long suffering, asexual, very similar to the Mama San kind of image, which is very much like the mother who's very Marinissimo and taking care of everyone. And this, like we said, is sort of very sort of the suffering one. Then similar to the Dragon Lady and the Good Time Girl, you have La Chismosa, who's about cheating and gossiping and emasculating and sneaky, self-centered type of stereotype. And then La Mosquito Muerta, which translates directly into the dead mosquito, but it's basically, again, someone who's appearing passive, yet is covertly sort of acting in ways to get her way using whatever tools. Now, if you look across all of these, they're very similar, but it's interesting how we frame them slightly different by using the identity of race. But like I said, for this lecture and the work I'm looking at is specifically Black womanhood. And I'm specifically looking at Black womanhood in the ways in which sexuality are framed using sexual scripting within mainstream media's appropriation of hip hop culture. So it's really critically important for me to talk about the foundation of my positionality here, and particularly the person who is central in terms of getting this body of work done from the psychological lens, which was my colleague, Lily Marapan. And when we're much older now, and when we were doing this, we're sort of identified as members of the hip hop generation when it was in its adolescence. So I was growing up when there was cross colors. I was when Queen Latifah was still doing Ladies First and not CoverGirl. So we've kind of been in the earlier stages of hip hop, but that's also gave us an introduction experience across it in terms of a longitudinal experience. So for that, we kind of are very protective of the culture and very clear that this is not about hip hop, but it's part of larger factors that are influencing the ways in which women are constructed in hip hop. And we recognize that shifting and changing, and people are operating within this sort of culture that is driven by money, by arts, by passion. There's multiple things pulling people. So we use both traditional in terms of research and non-traditional research approaches to understanding this. It's not enough to just check off boxes and put a lens on the outside. And we also bring in a critical race theory kind of lens to look at this, as well as a womanist framework to understand that this is not a black and white issue, and there's multiple factors that shape into what's occurring within this culture. One of the big things that we talk about is our concern that often Black women, particularly in the media, are framed really negatively around sexual health. And people could point to the research that shows, yes, that overall Black women, whether or not they're portrayed, they have high rates of negative sexual health outcomes without question. So we know based on the quantitative data or statistics, they experience higher rates of non-voluntary sex, which specifically we're talking about rape or sexual coercion, unplanned pregnancies, sexually transmitted infections. Again, that's about the lens and frameworks in which we're looking at it. But this also ties back to the fact that a lot of the ways in which Black women are framed gives them a sense that there's an idea that there's a knowledge about sexual risk-taking, but there's really not a discussion about sexuality. And we also don't think about the ways in which sexuality is constructed or socially scripted. And when we talk about that in terms of scripts are really sort of directed behaviors or schemas or ideas that we use to predict behaviors. So images are what we just see put in front of us, but the actual use of roles, which is the idea of scripts and sexual scripting, is really critical. And this is what we have to think about, that we've done a lot of scripting and framing of scripts of Black women in media historically, not just in hip hop, but we haven't really looked at them in broader empowered sexual beings. So again, think about it in terms of a role that a woman might present herself as highly sexual in a setting that is, for example, a nightclub, because that's appropriate. But when it turns to the next morning for church, that script would shift to something that's less sexualized or more focused in a different way. So we see these scripts played over and over again across media. Specifically, when we think about it in terms of Black youth, hip hop culture is really critical for understanding this, because it's one of the first spaces in which we see large numbers of young Black people in a way that we haven't seen before. And I'm going to talk about a little bit more later. So the scripts that are shown in hip hop culture, whether it's in videos, whether it's in today reality shows or other frameworks around that, really sort of formulate ideas and give ideas about expectations and roles. And often for Black women, it's tied to their sexuality. But we can't say this is about hip hop, because it's part of a larger trend and framework of how Black women's sexuality has been framed socio-historically. For that reason, I'm taking us way back to the Hottentot Venus. And I know you guys in the class today have covered some of this. So the Hottentot Venus, also known as Sarah Baartman, just to reiterate, again, this was the Black Venus. And she was from the Hottentot tribe off the Cape of Western Africa. And of course, we know that at that time where you lived dictated where you dressed. So the women who are from the Hottentot tribe do have extremely large buttocks, large hips, and they don't wear tops. Now, it's important to note that when people look at this, we sexualize it from a westernized lens. But the majority of the world don't look at breasts as a highly sexualized appendage, except from a westernized lens. So when you saw a ship captain came down to the Hottentot tribes, he saw these women with extremely large buttocks and not wearing tops, and of course gave his own meaning to that, which meant that these women were highly sexualized, when really it was just part of the cultural norms. It was hot, this is what you wore, and it was easier, of course, for breastfeeding. There's also arguments that Hottentots have extremely large buttocks because of storage of fat and their fact that they're a more nomadic tribe. But what specifically happened with Sarah Baartman was that the ship's captain, brought her up to France, and I use the word brought her up very loosely, with promises of wealth and all kinds of freedoms, etc. And essentially she was put on display. So if you were having a fashionable party during this time period, you would have paid, not her, but him, money for her to be on display at your party, hanging in a cage, sort of the equivalent of a go-go dancer. But in her case, they would dress her in a loincloth that was very close to her skin color. So essentially, it was like having a Black woman hanging in a cage that appeared to be nude. Over time, he was controlling the money, the captain, and he eventually sold her. Of course, if you read some narratives, they changed contracts, but he sold her, and they began to pay her with alcohol, and she then became an alcoholic. And as time went on, she became less and less of an attraction, and eventually she was basically shown in sideshows and carnivals for doing this, and she was prodded, and people would pay to poke at her buttocks to see it was real, etc. Now, for a long time, Henry Cuvier, who's a zoologist, had been wanting to examine her. And it's critical to remember that I'm talking about a zoologist here, because he wanted to see what her organs were and what was occurring in her body. And so when she did eventually die, he did dissect her body. So again, we're having this zoologist, so he's coming from a lens of looking at animals to dissect her body and give meanings. And what we found was, and this was in the medical journals for a long time, was he asserted that she had vagina denticea, which essentially meant that her vagina had teeth, which could then bite, and her vagina was extremely large. More than what a woman's would be, not like a larger woman's, but more than a woman's. And of course, this played onto another stereotype of complimentary for Black men, because her vagina had to be extremely large to accommodate the large Black male penis. So you see the way in which science itself has taken images of Black women and was able to shift it to meet its own needs and narratives as needed. So what I'm showing here are some posters of where you can see where she was being shown. And this was actually a Hottentotten woman, the one picture that's showing on the left here, during the World's Fair, where you could actually go to zoos and see people from all over the world, of course, the non-Western world, in their natural habitat, I say in quotes. But basically, they were in a zoo on display, and the Hottentotten tribe was a popular one on display. A side note about the Hottentotten Venus, her body was on display in the Museum of Man in Paris until the 1950s. And in the late 90s, Nelson Mandela was able to negotiate her body parts, and we're able to send it back to her people, the Hottentots, and they gave her a proper burial in the late 2000s. But you could see that this is a narrative that continued until quite recently in terms of her story is still, very fresh. But her story is really critical for thinking about the foundational images that we continue to see about Black womanhood. And so the researchers identified 4 foundational images of Black womanhood that are really central to understanding Black women in North American Western context today. So you see elements of the Hottentotten Venus, which transferred over to, and I use the word new, but New World, to sort of reinforce and maintain ideas about Black women that are really central to their sexuality in different ways and their sexuality's usefulness. So the first one was a Jezebel, and this is from the movie Tamango. And so the Jezebel is a Black woman who's sexually insatiable. She wants to have sex. She's highly sexualized. She's beautiful. She's immoral, and she's always tempting her master. She's tempting other men to get her way using her sexual skills and appearance. Typically, we see this in images. She's identified as Black, but she has features that we are associated and value more closely as white. So she would be lighter skinned, have slender nose, be tinier, have long hair, etc. And you could see this image played over and over. This, of course, is a scene of Dorothy Dandridge. They have the tragic mulatto. You can hear that story as well. Halle Berry plays into this script a lot over and over again. So you see the Jezebel. What's important to note is that framing her as being highly sexual also then is a way of sort of shifting the narrative that women were being raped. Particularly like these lighter skinned women who were often the result of rapes themselves, which is why they had these features that we might refer to as biracial. So you could see them which this narrative sort of helps justify certain identities that we see played over and over again in the media. The other one is the Mammy. And of course is Hattie McDaniels with Gone with the Wind. And she's asexual. And she basically puts the values of her white families over her own. So she's Black identified, and she has very Black African features. So they're usually famed as darker skin, larger, loving. It's interesting to note that this image that we see over and over again, Hattie McDaniels was the first Black woman to win an Academy Award, playing this type of protective, very type of image. And then the next Black woman to win an Academy Award would have been Whoopi Goldberg for Ghost, where she again played very stereotypical Black woman who was worrying about the characters, the Demi Moore and Patrick Swayze character over her own well-being, very asexual, etc. So there's a narrative that's occurring here in the media that's critical. The next foundational image is the welfare queen. And this is a clip from the movie Claudine. And this is, of course, the idea that Black women then were having babies to breed. And it's important to note that welfare was really started for women who were widowed by the war. And per capita, there are more white women on welfare than there are Black, but we still think of it as very much a Black thing, that women are having babies, Black women specifically, are having babies to essentially breed and live off the system. And which, again, doesn't fit with the actual research on this. And the fact is you cannot live off the system on what you get on welfare. But this image is played over and over again because it also helps justify certain political frameworks and ideas. And we see this in the media in terms of popular imagery as well. And then the fourth foundational image was the matriarch. And this, of course, is Pam Grier's Foxy Brown. And this is a woman who uses her sexuality to sort of emasculate and be strong and tough, sort of like the sexy, strong Black woman. But at the same time, she's considered the source of the Black community's problem. So if you've heard of Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan, he was a senator for New York in the 1960s. And he was actually commissioned to find out what was wrong with the Black community. Because, of course, in the 1960s was when there was a lot of civil rights protests going on, civil unrest. So something had to be wrong with the Black community for these issues to be going on. Not perhaps that people were trying to fight for equality, but so he actually did a study, and it's called the Moynihan Report. And in this report, the central argument was the problem of what's happening in the Black community is that it's matriarchal and that Black women are too emasculating and controlling, and this is where a lot of the unrest is. And most libraries have a copy, at least university libraries have copies of this. So this is basically the idea that Black women are too strong and controlling, and this is what the issue is, and her sexuality is too overpowering. So you could see the ways in which these images, which fit with certain historical period trends of what's happening, were reinforced through movies and are continuing to play out today. So today's images where we saw Blacks most powerfully is in hip hop. Because for a while, when you watch movies, the way they're framed were very set to specific cultures. But with the advent of music videos, you really saw this shift. And it's important to think that this is really a fairly new phenomenon, because you have to remember the first Black male who actually got regular rotation on MTV was Michael Jackson. And he was pushing or selling a very sort of soft, mainstream type of pop music. But where you really saw an onslaught of Blacks coming onto in terms of being seen very often was when hip hop became mainstream. But to step back a little bit, hip hop is now pushing 50 years old. Actually, it's over 50 years old because it really began in the 70s, early 70s, late 60s. And it really sort of picked up as we began to see problems within the urban decaying cities, particularly in the New York region. So it really began as an urban African-American, and I should also stress Nuyorican, so Puerto Ricans that were living in New York. So there was a strong Latino presence as well. But it began as a sort of urban cultural response to Reaganomics, where the idea was that everybody should be able to pull themselves up and pick themselves up and be successful. And it doesn't matter what's going on in your life, and wealth will trickle down. So Reagan also had that if people at the top are wealthy, the money will trickle down. The reality is we knew that wasn't what was happening. So Reaganomics also got rid of a lot of support systems, welfare systems, social systems. So you saw what happened in cities, etc. So you saw this growth of hip hop, which was a lot of rapping and poetics that were discussing what was going on in these communities. It's since gone through various phases and different types of foci, which really shift how we looked at women and how it's framed the messages around Black womanhood and hip hop. So sort of looking at a hip hop timeline, it's particularly as it relates to women, in the late 70s to mid 80s, again, it was Reaganomics. It was very New York City specific, and it was Nuyorican and Black. Those were the main, it was urban produced. So you had Sugar Hill Records, they were Black record companies, and it was consumed in Black spaces. You were not finding it on TV. It was really sort of something that was underground. You had to basically buy mixtapes or know someone or know what record store to go get it from, because it was not something that was as widespread. Then the mid to late 80s, you saw it sort of shifting a little bit, and it became more of a party type of music. So it became partying. There was a whole push for safe sex. And there was a real sort of Afrocentrism, which also tied into the anti-apartheid movement. If you look at the music that was coming out during that time, you saw a lot of things that were taking place from Public Enemy, KRS-One, but then there was also partying from Kid and Play. Salt and Pepper had the first gold album as women. But so you began to see that corporations or mainstream culture was buying up the record companies, but it was still being sold specifically to Black communities. And in fact, during this period, the only place you would see hip hop videos were the 1 hour on Saturday afternoons with Yo MTV Raps. Otherwise, it was MTV was predominantly rock music and pop music, except for Michael Jackson. But Yo MTV Raps with Fab Five Freddy was the one show in the afternoon that you were able to see hip hop videos and see this type of music, which wasn't that long ago, which is interesting when you look at how it shifted today. Then the early to mid 90s is when it really exploded, these images. And that tied with gangster rap and R&B being mixed. And that was because the mainstream ownership. There's a really good documentary out there called Beyond the Beats. I encourage you to watch it. It talks about homophobia and gender and masculinity and hip hop. But they have a lot of people who were in the industry at that time who were told, and they talk about this, that they were told to push gangster rap. And that is when the companies began to support it and began to push it to be presented in videos on television, because then you had, of course, gangster rap is the highly stereotypic thug, gangsters, Black men being menacing. And along with them, you had the girls who were basically sexual accessories or being the same type of stereotype violence. So what you saw was, prior to this, if you were a female dancer, you actually had to be able to dance. I always like to look back at the old videos, like Kid and Play videos, even Poison during that time. You had the female dancers were dancers. You had to have skills. But you saw that the ownership shifted, that women then became background dancers. And then again, mainstream ownership, and it began to get a mixed audience, and you'd see more and more videos being played in mainstream. Then the mid to late 90s, you saw the growth of the dirty sound, you saw reggaeton, you saw the Bhangra, you saw different cultures mixing in. So women began to shift as artists, but more and more their roles as video dancers moved to the background. And the idea of dancers was not the same. It really shifted to being accessories. And dancing was not about any sort of skill. It was really about presenting yourself as a sexual object and satisfying the male gaze. And at that time, you stopped seeing a lot of ownership of the big level ownership by small record companies, and mainstream owned them, Time Warner, etc. And it was being produced and consumed by mainstream culture. And so it's from there we're now seeing where we are today, and things still continue to shift. So really today, hip hop is no longer, we like to say that hip hop is a art form, etc. But if we look at mainstream hip hop, and I'm going to stress that we're really talking about mainstream commercialized hip hop, it's really material and consumer culture. Then we're seeing a lot of cross culture. You see it used in commercials. You see them, even Macy's has kids hip hop dancing and rapping in their back to school commercials. So how more mainstream can you get? But central to this is still this idea of the image of Blackness. And when we're talking about this image of Blackness in terms of what's being presented in the mainstream, is that the men are basically these ghetto fabulous millionaires, and the women are really sort of they're commodities. Even when you're looking at women who are successful on their own right, they're really successful where their sexuality is framed. And this is whether or not they want to be this way. This is what is expected within this mainstream framework. So for women, their greatest commodity is their sexuality. And you can see this in really some distinct ways in terms of how women are framed as commodities. One of the things that's unique to hip hop is that there are usually two versions of music videos. For a while there, we used to have the BET Uncut, which played at night. So you had the regular version of the video, and then at midnight you can go watch the X-rated or porn version of the video. So you knew there was the sexuality, what was framed as acceptable, but then it shifted to the next level with the two versions. The other thing is it's not uncommon now for industry figure crossovers. So you'd see, for example, this is Heather Hunter, who is a famous porn actress who was able to parlay her skills into photography, but she's also featured in videos and she got lots of shout outs. But even Cardi B was a stripper and now she's one of the top rappers, etc. So you see that there's this real sort of crossing over. And even the other related to this is you have adult videos. You don't see this happening with country music or other forms. So Snoop Dogg had a XXX video called Snoop's Doggy Style, and it won 2 trophies at the 2002 Adult Video News Awards. And this was basically his first official foray into the porn world, but he's been followed by several others. So it actually won the Best Music Award at the Adult Video News Awards, and it was named the top-selling tape of 2001, according to the movie's producer, which was Hustler Video. It featured some of his songs by his proteges, but he also is featured walking through. And essentially, like we said, it was one big porn video that was basically set up like a music video. So you see the ways in which hip hop, in terms of the mainstream culture, has sort of crossed over and integrated highly sexualized images of women and, of course, complementary male images in a way that's viewed as acceptable, while prior to the culture shift, before it was being mainstreamed, where it was more about empowerment and having fun, there wasn't this pushing. So this is really critical to think about. Now, a lot of us might just think, well, what's the big deal about this? And this requires us to go and look at the research about hip hop and media in general. So again, we have to think about hip hop being one of the first forms of presenting young Black youth and young adults in terms of a mass mainstream audience. And so the research shows that for other people who don't mix with people of other races, which is basically most of the United States and anyone in the Western world, in real meaningful ways. And when I see meaningful, the way I always talk about it, if someone's your friend, is just someone that could just show up at your house no matter how messy it is, and you can talk openly about your personal feelings or issues around race and politics and not feel uncomfortable, etc. Most people don't have these cross cultural relationships. So as a result, media serves as a window into the lives of others, and they become portrayals or facts for people who don't have relationships in this way in terms of presenting how they look at people. So when we're looking at media, not just mainstream hip hop, but all forms of media, it really sort of relies often on stereotypical presentations that shape how people start looking at the other. And in this case, I'm specifically talking Black women. Now, for Black women themselves, we do know that television portrayals are critical, because research has shown that television programming, particularly that's focused on entertainment, it has been identified as one of the most important socialization sources for African American teens. So what you're seeing is that these music videos are selling and creating scripts about behaviors through visual cues. But there's a suggestion that videos are just portraying what's happening outside versus basically the videos are trying to sell something. And that's one of the discussions that we can talk about. So we can see that hip hop is part of a larger framework of a historical lens in which we look at Black women. And so it's part of it's important again to stress that this is not about mainstream hip hop being problematic, but it's about situating mainstream hip hop into a larger narrative of Black womanhood. And I'm going to sort of frame this by going back then to those foundational images, the Jezebel, the Mammy, the welfare mother, and the matriarch, and look at the ways in which they've now become sexual scripts, again, roles that we see being marketed and pushed and normalized within mainstream hip hop. The first one I want to talk about is the diva. And in the diva, you see elements of the Jezebel, and probably one of the earliest big promoted ones of this is Mariah Carey. And of course, today that would be Beyonce. And her sexuality, in terms of how it's framed in this script, is it's really about her social status. So you'll see that she is independent and taking care of herself, but she is also going to have a male partner who bolsters her image. So she's not going to be with the broke guy who doesn't have anything, but she has to have a partner who is going to be supportive or complementary. So it really projects these upper middle class and middle class values. And so she's independent, but within the context of a heterosexual relationship. And that heterosexual relationship is important in terms of the importance of males valuing of the script, because that's what shapes a lot of these, but also the meaning of heterosexuality when we're talking about the scripts. As I get further along, I'll discuss it. So to be a diva, you have to be well maintained, often again, long hair, lighter skin. And you could even see this when you're looking at famous singers. As they moved up more and more popular, they start looking in a certain way. I know there was a while where Mary J got flack because when she first came out, she was a roundaway girl, and then as time went on, and she became the queen of hip hop soul, she sort of became more mainstream. And there were even disagreements about her lightening her skin, which was the same thing we heard about Salt and Pepper and Beyonce. But the idea that you could see these same sort of critiques about the foundational images are also found in the sexual script, the diva. The next one, again, that we found with our research that we conducted was the gold digger. And Miami's own Trina was one of the originals out there, and it was about girls who use their sexuality for economic gain. We're not talking blatantly about prostitution in terms of it's about selling sex, but it is about, I recognize this as a commodity and I'm going to use it as such, which is basically using for economic gain. And it might just be used purposely through the language and how she dresses and how she projects herself, or it just might be through her behaviors. And so it's framed as she does what she has to do to get the material resources she needs. And the material resources could be things like survival, like I'll look good and be with this guy because he's putting a roof over my head, or you know what, I'm with this guy because if he's going to be stupid enough to pay my bills and buy me diamonds, I'll be there. It's interesting that when we did our research, this script is one that the men really hated. The diva men liked. They would, if we asked them what they would want for their sisters, and we'll talk about later on, they would like the diva and the other one, the sister savior. But men really dislike this gold digger. And you can think about this, one of the earliest discussions was the relationship between Mike Tyson and Robin Givens. And where people were really angry was it was like she got over on the champ. And there's this resentfulness that because for males, the economics and the appearance of money is their power, the gold digger is basically taking away some of that economics from the males and in some ways getting over on him. So this is a really interesting image in that you like the sexuality, but if you're mad that she gets too much from you, the gold digger becomes very negative. The next one is the freak. And of course, one of the first famous ones for this, of course, was Little Kim and Foxy Brown, and today we see it's being played over and over again by other actors, Nicki Minaj, etc. And so the freak is this female image where she's having sex on her own terms. So she's doing it to achieve her own insatiable sexual desires. And again, here you see elements of the Jezebel playing out. When you saw the gold digger, you saw elements of the welfare mother. But here, this one is using her body to basically have sex and be proud of it. What's important to think about is that who really controls their sexuality? Can you be really overweight or unattractive or wear a tracksuit and still play the freak character and get the same projection? And if you look at that, you're not really seeing that and get the same response. No. So is the freak really in control, or is she using an image that's out there and using it in her terms to control, but she's still falling into the stereotype? And that's one of the things we discuss in the paper about this. But there is the idea of the freak, and she's the woman who basically has sex anywhere, anytime, but she will feel it's on her terms and she's empowered about it. Now, if you have sex with another woman and you let a man watch, you're a freak. But if you have sex with another woman and you don't want a male there, then you're considered a dyke. And I want to stress that this is not the same as women loving women. This is really negative. And so for a long time, Queen Latifah had this image pushed on her. And then we also talk about Missy Elliott. What's interesting about both of these women when they talk about the Dyke, and again, is that these are two women who are actually very successful in hip hop beyond being rappers and artists. They themselves own very successful production companies. They manage some very successful male groups and write songs that others are using. So these are actually women who are very much in control of their careers on their own terms, and they dress in what they want to wear. They don't always play the highly sexualized role, and they're very successful even when they're just in a sweatsuit. But when we're talking about the Dyke, this is specifically when you're using it as a backlash of being against men. So again, it's not the same as women loving women or lesbian or the freak. So she embodies traditional masculine qualities, both in terms of her appearance, her personality, and even her behavior and power. So her empowerment is really framed outside of the male-defined expectations of how she should look and present herself. And so this is the Dyke script that's often used or spoken about, and we found as emerging when we did our research on this. The next kind of tough one that came out was the Gangsta Bitch. And of course, MC Lyte was one of the first tough girls, and then Keisha Cole plays on this. But it's the girl who's right alongside with the guys. We talk about the endangered black male out there. Well, this is the girl that's out there. So her sexuality is really tied to being her physical and emotional survival along with her man. And like MC Lyte had her song called Roughneck, and she talks about she's a roughneck right along with him and wants to be with a roughneck, and that's the type of guy. So they're very tough and masculine. They recognize the environment and the culture, but they recognize the power of their feminine touches within there. So she does what she has to do to get what her male peers or partner desires. And they're also sometimes referred to as a gangstress. And this is a survivor, and you have to hustle, but you do it within the framework of being a gangsta bitch script that plays out over and over again. So this is the ride or die chick that you see talked about often in mainstream hip hop. Now there's other genres that are important to talk about that are not necessarily in the mainstream, but emerged during our research when we're identifying it. There's this whole genre of gospel hip hop, and so from there you see the Sister Savior, but you also hear about this type of script talked about in songs like DMX in his song Good Girls Bad Guys, couldn't treat her like a hood rat, didn't bite her, turn a church girl into a straight rough rider. So these are the church girls. These are the girls that are not using their sexuality because they're really tied to the idea of God. And so it's important that's really tied around organized religion values. So it's about God told me, no, I'm not supposed to do this, or church told me not, I'm not supposed to do this. So it's a controlled sexuality. And it's framed that if you're too sexual, there are going to be negative consequences based on religious institutions, frameworks about what is appropriate for women within this space and how they present themselves, which is different than the Earth Mother. And that is where it's more of a spirituality connection. And so earlier on, it was Erykah Badu, India Arie had these songs. And then it's interesting that these are the idea that it's very African-centric embraced. So it's about sexuality is tied to bringing up the community. It's tied to bringing strength, respecting other women, respecting other men. Often in these scripts, they're portrayed as artistic, nonconformists, alternative, and they also embrace images and presentations of themselves that are very much Afrocentric. So you see elements of the Mammy, even though it's not framed within there, but they're challenging both white standard norms and sexualized norms about women within these images. So again, across these 7 images I've presented so far, you can see elements of the Jezebel, the welfare mama, in the gold digger. You could see elements of the matriarch, where she's controlling and emasculating, which was part of the Dyke, and also you see bits of the Earth Mother, and then of course you see the Mammy and the Earth Mother, and also in the Church Girl. So those images have been picked and teased apart and recreated in a new way within hip hop across these scripts. The final script I kind of want to end with is the baby mama. And this is that you could be any of those scripts, but once you have had a baby with this male, your whole script identity shifts. So again, we have Michelle, who used to be with Dr. Dre, and everybody still talks about her as Dr. Dre's baby mama or Suge Knight's baby mama, even though she had her own career on her own right. Same with Tiny, T.I.'s wife now. when you're watching this, we don't know where it is, but Tiny herself, she was more successful before TI. She was with Escape. She's written a lot of top songs. The songs No Scrubs, she actually wrote. So she's very successful and talented. She has her own company. She manages groups, but people always still think about her as TI's wife and baby mama. So it's this idea that her sexuality has created this impermanent and emotional economic tie to her partner, which is tied to the fact that she's had a child. So this framework that that's where her identity lies plays out a lot in the scripts that are being pushed in mainstream hip hop, both in videos, in narratives, and the projections that we use playing over and over again in reality shows, etc., around these identities of Black womanhood, particularly as it relates to her sexuality. So some people would suggest, well, these are just the images, but it's not necessarily what's happening out there, that the messages we're seeing are just being sold and packaged for entertainment purposes, and that's not how people really are behind the scenes, that these people are just regular people otherwise, or on the flip side, this is what regular people want to be, and we're trying to flip it. So how are the issues that we're seeing, or these scripts, how are they influencing behaviors and people's perceptions of things when it really comes to the real world? And what we're first going to look at is it's the ways in which these images have an influence on beliefs and behaviors. So there was a study that was done with white college students where they were filled out a survey on Black women's perceptions of Black women's personalities. And then they sat and watched hip hop videos. And then after watching the videos, they went back and evaluated Black women's personalities. And what they found was, after watching these videos, there was a significant decrease in their positive perceptions of Black women when they looked at these videos that were devoid of love and they were highly sexually titillating, that it actually made them look at Black women more negatively the more you watch them. For us, when we did these scripts, what we found was that we tested them, we did content analysis, people recognized each of these age scripts, and people's meanings and the definitions they gave were consistent across all groups. And we collected data from 12-year-olds right up to 28-year-olds. So these understanding of scripts are actually becoming normalized and understood, and people were giving examples not just of what they saw in videos, but also they applied it to how they saw peers or family members and other people. So it's translating into their real world. And then Carla Stokes did a study where she looked at girls' representations of themselves on social media pages. And what she found was a lot of the girls used these scripts in terms of how they presented themselves in social media. That wasn't who they were, but they drew upon the images they saw of these women and who were getting certain types of response in terms of how they want to present themselves in social media. When we go more specific into the ways in which we perceive people and look at different types of outcomes, the first one that always pops up as important to consider when we think about Black women's sexuality and scripting in mainstream hip hop are the influence of these scripts on gender role beliefs. So one of the studies I did found that beliefs about attitudes of women's attractiveness based on what was seen in those videos directly influenced both males and females' ideas about associated sexual scripts. So basically, if you found a woman that was appearing to be a freak, you treated the girl to look like that. Or if you saw a woman that presented herself as being a sister savior, you treated her like that. And also, this is really critical for understanding the ways in which intimate relationships are formed. When you think about the meanings that we give to a freak or a diva or a gold digger, that if we're using these scripts to predict how we want to have interpersonal relationships, it can become really problematic. Monique Ward at University of Michigan did a study where she found that the more often people viewed mainstream hip hop music videos, the more likely they were to endorse or accept traditional gender role attitudes. And that means basically that women are obviously supposed to be more passive and men are supposed to be in control and dominating, and there's certain behaviors that are appropriate for men and not for women. And the more they watched these videos, it was found that participants assigned greater importance to people following specific stereotype attributes and attributes in terms of their personality and how they presented themselves. These participants, again, that watched these videos were more likely to express more traditional views about gender and people's roles in sexual relationships. Another study I found, which tied back to something I spoke about earlier, were that when men were asked about what they would like their sisters or the cousins to be like, they were more likely to view this diva and sister savior as appropriate scripts for those that were close to them or they viewed as part of their family, because these were good and nice in terms of sexual behaviors, and the other scripts were not viewed as appropriate. So you could see that these scripts also give ideas about how women are supposed to be or how we judge women based upon these scripts, which are really, again, sort of images which have an added layer of prescribed specific behavioral expectations. The next piece that was critical to think about was how these scripts also influence perceptions of physical attractiveness. And again, remember we talked about the idea for men, it's really, their strength is really tied to their ability to be the ghetto fabulous millionaire, have money, while women's strength is tied to her sexuality. Because often women in hip hop videos, even when they are the main character, are really framed around their ability to bolster males' masculinity through their own sexuality and femininity. So their bodies are often their greatest commodity. And you can see this in terms of even the way angles and shots and where we focus on women, how women are focused on in terms of, we look at what parts of their bodies, how are they supposed to be dressed. You will rarely see a camera shooting from a male above looking down at a male. Usually instead you have the camera where the man is looking down at the camera. For women, it's sometimes just focused on bits of their bodies or focusing on just part of them. So that's a way of partitioning it. Another piece that was really important that was found in the research were that these mainstream presentations also reinforce the valuing of lighter skin over darker skin. And in my study, again, it was found that among the adolescent boys, girls that were lighter skinned in these scripts, and particularly associated the diva with lighter skin, were viewed as not only just more attractive, but nicer. So there were these positive associations based on these physical cues that tied into how they viewed them as people. While adolescent girls viewed dark and light skins as equally attractive. So the girls viewed it differently, but the males gave some very different perceptions, and particularly which script had these perceptions as really important. And this again has implications for intimate relationships and other behavioral outcomes, which we'll talk about in a little bit. In our study as well, males, as we talk about with the camera, partitioned female bodies out where they were discussed about in terms of their pieces. So men would talk about their butts, their breasts in a very specific way instead of as a whole person. So these scripts, because of their sexuality, also shape the ways in which women are studied. And another study that was done where there was a content analysis, you also find that these scripts really want women presenting in a very different way. And particularly in hip hop videos, they were extremely thin women. And what you would find is that even if women were more shapely, it was usually about specific body parts, their butts or their breasts, rather than their overall body requirements. So even though there's this narrative that we like curvy women, overall based on the scientific measures of what is rated as thin, women in hip hop that are viewed as most attractive by these scripts are rated as thin with partitioned body parts that are highly sexualized. So you could see that how this plays into how you look at women is important. Another piece though is that you found that when the videos themselves are focusing on sex or materialism, you saw women with smaller body sizes. But when the videos are featuring issues that are related to political awareness, so say the song was about poverty or homelessness or some aspect of social justice, you saw more diversity in women's body size, particularly larger sized women, and not necessarily women who might be overweight, but also just more diversity and perhaps more normal size in terms of fitting with what women in the real world actually look like. So you could see even what is being packaged and sold around sexuality is really playing still on stereotypes that reinforce westernized ideals, even if it is the Black female body that's being presented. We also know that it does impact attitudes towards sexual risk-taking as well. And there's a study done by Dr. Gina Wingood where they looked at African-American female adolescents. And those that viewed these images with higher levels of sexual content, they found that they are more likely to have multiple sex partners, have sex more often, not use a contraception, and more likely to have STD. And in that study, they used gonorrhea. Again, it's not that the videos are causing this, but you see this normalization of sexualization. And particularly, there's very little discussion about safer sex or sexuality more broadly. Dr. Shani Peterson at Spelman also found that girls perceiving that there were more sexual stereotypes in hip hop videos were more likely to have used marijuana, binge drink, have multiple sex partners, and hold negative body images. Again, it's not that these videos are causing it, but these mainstream scripts are really sort of shaping and normalizing these behaviors. Dr. Gina Wingood also found that African-American females who watch these images were more likely to have negative attitudes towards condom use and have a stronger desire to want to have babies. And in our study, we found adolescent males said that they would use condoms with the freak script, for example, but they didn't say they would necessarily need to use condoms with the Diva or the Sister Savior. So sexual risk-taking was also informed by their perceptions of if these are good girls or bad girls in terms of the girls' potential for sexual risk. So again, you could see that these images or these scripts are beyond images, and they're actually serving to shape ideas or teach people or sort of normalize certain behaviors and beliefs around sexual risk-taking as well. The next one we want to look at is intimate partner violence, because one study found that music videos that revealed violence and criminal activity were more common in rap and rock music videos as compared to country, the adult contemporary music, and R&B music videos. So you could see that the hip hop version of were more likely to integrate violence and criminal activity. And again, I want to think back to when did hip hop become mainstream and crossover, and how does that play into the images and the scripts that are being pushed, and for what reason? Also, in our study, we found that pre-adolescent males and females believe that girls who were presenting themselves as highly sexualized or accepting of those scripts should not be surprised if they experience rape or other forms of sexual assault. So victimization is viewed as part of presenting or embracing certain scripts that are being seen and shown as well. Now, this is a while ago, of course, there was the whole case of intimate partner violence, dating violence that occurred between Chris Brown and Rihanna. And there were some studies that came out around this, but the Boston Public Health Commission did a quick study where they asked high school students what they thought about the case. And what they found was that Rihanna was at fault for what happened. Over half of them said that. And part of this argument was that she kept arguing with him even though she knew she was violent, and she must have done something to make him violent. And we did a study, and other people have found that part of it is that there was the idea that she should have known her place, and that part of this was part of being submissive and feeling that women are supposed to be in certain roles, particularly in terms of what's being projected and shown as being appropriate behaviors for women, particularly when it comes to sexuality situations. Now, I want to go back again and keep stressing, you hear me saying that this is not about mainstream hip hop, it's part of a larger issue, because again, these findings, although empirically based, are really correlational. And what does that mean? When something's correlational, it means that these two things are occurring, that when this is happening, but it does not say that it's happening because of this. So it doesn't show a direction of what's happening. So you can't say that hip hop is causing these behaviors, but we do know that while this is happening, their people are engaging, or young adults are engaging in high levels of hip hop. So you don't know which is coming first or which is having the influence. So you can't conclude that these issues are happening because of mainstream hip hop behavior. But what we do know is that there's a relationship between the two, and it could be about the context, the settings, or the normalization. And so it's really critical to think about, why is it that this is accepted in these context settings and cultural spaces, and who is making the decisions about this and its implications for behavior. Also, it's important to think about also, why is there so much research and focus on this, given that there's other experiences and other forms of music of domestic violence among very well-known artists in hip hop, not only in hip hop, in country music, in rock, in all sorts of forms of music, that it's important to not focus that a lot of these types of situations are really individual, than rather a reflection of the culture. But we do recognize that the culture is important to critique, and wonder why in mainstream hip hop we're finding this, and why it's so critical to consider. And so there's a few things when we talk about this, people start pointing fingers, but there's really a complex relationship of things that are going on. So a lot of times people say, well, the women shouldn't be promoting these scripts. And part of that has to do with, well, let's think about the importance of videos in hip hop culture. Mainstream hip hop, of course, has been appropriated and it's now a business, but that also means that some people are now getting recognized and paid for the work they do. And we're beginning to see more and more of the people that are creating the culture getting ownership of it. So we can't just throw out the baby with the bathwater, as you say, is that we have to start looking at that there's a lot of positives. So one of the things we have to start thinking about is how much responsibility do young adult women and Black women have around this? Well, for those that are watching these videos, we need to increase their media literacy and their sexual health literacy. Media literacy in terms of understanding and discussing how these scripts are formed, why they are there, and framing them within what I've done here, a larger historical context. But in terms of sexual script literacy, we do a lot of the plumbing of sex, but we're not doing a lot of education around the discussion of sexuality, of not moving beyond how to have or not have sex, but gaining more skills around sexual empowerment. And part of this is having more discussions about physical attractiveness, healthy relationships, and gender role expectations that really shift depending on where women are in their lives in terms of their age, where they're living, who their partners are, and also what their family and community belief systems are. And we don't have these discussions. So that's really important to think about when we're thinking about, well, the young adult Black women that are watching this, what tools are we giving them to help them negotiate what's being shown? Other people say, well, the parents should be taking control, and this is a parents. Well, one thing we have to think about today is hip hop, like we said, is 50 years old. Grandparents are part of this culture. So it's not just that these are young kids watching this, but parents are also part of this culture and engaging in it. But at the same time, hip hop is one of the few genres that emerged without parent input over time. So parents are involved, but you might not be playing music or going to the same spaces to engage. So parents are central and are usually, and from the research has shown, the initial sources of sexual health information and empowerment for adolescents, even during adolescence when they want to push it off. But the ways in which pop culture is pushed in the media, it's really age specific and it's targeting. And even today, when you look at it as a music, we often don't listen to it together. So long ago, you would have maybe had one record player in the house and one television. Now everyone can listen to the music and pick their things on their own through their own cell phone, or you could sit in your room and watch it on your iPad. So parents have, although they might be listening to the music and part of the culture, they might be listening to a different form or thinking about another developmental stage of the music. But are they actually having these discussions and engaging in the same type of music and spaces? So parental engagement might be some of the issues that should be addressed in terms of discussing how hip hop culture is having these influences and on Black women's sexuality and sexual beliefs. Then the last people look at hip hop as a culture. And so what we're really talking about is what came first, the chicken or the egg? Is the music an expression of what's going on in society, or is society an expression of what's going on in the music? This is something that we can debate forever, but what we really have to start thinking about is what is mainstream hip hop about? And this is, again, mainly mainstream. So some people would say it's a business, some say it's art, a source of activism. It can be all. But when we look at it in terms of mainstream hip hop, it is a multi-million-dollar business. And the business means that it's going to market what sells and what's easy, which of course is playing on stereotypes. It doesn't necessarily mean the songs that are liked the most get played, but the songs that are being pushed and the artist. And if you're wondering if it really is a business, you hear about artists retiring or shifting to another focus. So you have to start thinking about what that means and what that means for how people look at this and their responsibility. Women are also moving into positions of power at increasing rates within the culture, but there's a few spaces to address gender dynamics constructively, and at what cost? And this is not just women doing it, but also men. Because if you do start challenging and start politicizing and questioning, will that fit within the business model of mainstream hip hop culture? And these are the things that we have to start thinking about and discussing when we're thinking about the ways in which these sexual scripts have historically been built upon stereotypes that harm Black women, have been rearticulated within hip hop, and will continue to exist and probably be reinvented in different ways, but still having these underlying messages. I think the way that I like to think about it is about your own responsibility and where you want to be in terms of discussing this. And so I like this song by Most Deaf, Black on Both Sides, which kind of frames who is responsible. And I think it comes back to you, and you could be the individual you and your peers or your community, etc. And this is what you have to think about, that we talk about it like it's something that's happening out there, when it's really our engagement as part of allowing and encouraging these types of scripts to exist, or even contributing to the ways in which they're reshaped or manipulated in different ways. So we have to start thinking about, what are we talking about when we talk about mainstream hip hop? Is it different? Why is there a mainstream hip hop versus others? Why are women presented in this way? And also, what do these presentations do for males? You know, do we have flip sides in terms of how this affects males, etc.? So a lot of this is about doing more discussion, getting more literacy around hip hop, mainstream hip hop, business of hip hop, discussing sexual identity and the different tools that exist out there. And so I think that's where we kind of have to start looking and keep moving forward. So what we'll do is continue talking about this, but I encourage you to look at some of the resources that I do actually have on my website, but we can continue having a discussion here about these scripts and the ways in which they've changed, and the ways in which they are changing are going to continue to change, and how it will hopefully also start changing in a way that moves us to be more empowering and have more accurate portrayals of the diversity of Black women's experiences and ownership of their sexuality, both in the media and within their broader real lives.